right, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is while you're listening to this. I hope you are doing well. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. Got a great conversation for you today. We're talking with my good friend Mike Koncewicz. Had him on the show a couple years ago. Having him back now because his amazing book and his amazingly relevant book is his actually frustratingly relevant book is out in paperback right now, and everyone should be reading it. I think people who listen to The Trap will especially like it. It's called They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. And it's really about sort of understanding how power structures within the executive work, how they work during the Nixon administration, and of course, people are going to be thinking a lot about abuses of power in the Trump administration as well. So Mike's just been doing the rounds with this book, and I'm so happy for him that it's been a big success. But I wanted to talk to Mike today about a movie, about a very specific movie. Not sure if you've seen this one. It came out in 1995, directed by Oliver Stone. It's called Nixon. Anthony Hopkins, yes, Hannibal Lecter plays Richard Nixon, and we talk about how successful that performance is. But really, Mike and I are both people that, you know, we were raised in a certain time, and this is Oliver Stone movies are kind of our nostalgia trap. We watched a lot of them, and they made a big impact on our attitudes towards 20th century history. And we now are now, you know, both of us are now professional historians, people that have, you know, read a lot and thought a lot about the 20th century. We have very different ideas about what Oliver Stone is really doing in his movies. So this was a really, really fun conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I think, spoiler alert, we have a very different attitude about what Oliver Stone's history thing is in film, and that might be why we called this episode Losing My Edge. But I wonder what you think about Oliver Stone's films, because he's a figure, no matter how much we deconstruct him and talk about how frustrating he is as a filmmaker in this conversation, he's still someone that I think, as people who think about American history and pop culture, we've got to come to terms with Stone, because Oliver Stone has a very specific sort of take, and is probably, as we talk about here, one of the most well-known cultural producers when it comes to the history we talk about. So, you know, the 1960s to today. And he's also got this, you know, like lefty streak. I mean, it's an important conversation. So I hope you enjoy this. We've got a lot more stuff going on our Patreon right now. If you're not a Nostalgia Trap Patreon subscriber, you're honestly missing out on some of the best content we've ever put out. We're talking to Danny Bessner a lot about movies in Los Angeles in the 1990s. Our LA movie series has been really, really fun, and we got a lot more people listening and commenting. And speaking of that, we have our first live show Wednesday night for those who are subscribed at our Culture Warrior level. So go over to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I'll be sending out a Zoom link Wednesday, October 21st at noon for our show, which is going to be at 5 o'clock Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll be talking about the movie Back to the Future with Danny Bessner, Courtney Rawlings, Bill Black, and all the folks who are subscribed and are going to hopefully bring some good questions and ideas about what I consider to be the ultimate 20th century nostalgia trap, Back to the Future. I'm so excited about talking about that film with my friends. So come join us if you want to take a wacky ride into the past and the future with us at our live show. That's going to be really, really fun. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where you get all of our bonus episodes and everything else. And we thank a million times the people who are supporting the show, because it really makes the whole thing super fun to do. All right. Thanks so much, and enjoy this conversation. Here is me on Nixon with Mike Koncewicz. All right, Mike. Well, I went down the Oliver Stone rabbit hole for you last night. We're both, I think, recent viewers of the film Nixon. Thanks for watching that movie for Nostalgia Trap.
Oh, well, thank you for watching it. I was the one who suggested it, and I don't know if I should apologize or take credit for bringing up this movie.
Well, I mean, part of me is like, are you sick of thinking about Richard Nixon because you wrote a book about Nixon? You know what I mean? It seems like at some point, but at the same time, he seems like an endless well of sort of interest, right?
Yeah. So yeah, my book came out 2 years ago, and it seems like kind of beating a dead horse at this point, comparing Nixon and Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The comparisons are a little too easy now. What I try to encourage people whenever I give book talks or I talk to students is like, don't focus on the parallels, instead focus on the process. But that seems almost impossible to do, since it seems like we're living through like some cheap, like weird cover of the Watergate era.
I know, it's really weird.
Without the political culture of the 1970s,
Yeah, I talked to Rick Perlstein a couple of weeks ago, and like I tried to avoid like asking that question, like how is Nixon like Trump, how is Reagan like Trump, and that sort of thing, because it's a nostalgia trap. Like Watergate seems like it's like the reference point for whatever reason. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but like, I mean, even the fact that like Woodward has an appearance in the whole Trump saga and how liberals respond to that. Does it seem like something that's familiar to you, in the sense that people really, really want to sort of make connections between the Watergate era and the Trump era?
Yeah, and it's because I think it gives people comfort. And that makes sense. But, well, for one, if I focus on my own research, I often remind people that I started my research project as a dissertation, and the people I was thinking about were the people in the Bush administration. I was thinking of Colin Powell in 2003, and why, like, he decided that there was no real incentive for him to actually stand up to George W. Bush in the lead up to the Iraq War. And so that's what I was thinking of in 2010 and 2011. And of course, Trump happened. Trump was in the air back then, but once Trump became president, it became clear that a lot of the things I was thinking of were coming to fruition. But a lot of people aren't focusing on the process. Instead, they're focusing on the things that make them feel comfortable. And so seeing Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein on TV, I mean, Bernstein's on CBS, on CNN, like every week or so, telling people this is worse than Watergate. You say that, and if you say that enough, then people aren't going to take it seriously. If you say it over and over and over again. John Dean's another one. John Dean was a guy who was nice enough to talk to me for my book, but it seems like he's on CNN every other week saying this is worse than Watergate. And people, I think, become numb to that after a while.
Wasn't that the name of John Dean's book about the Bush administration?
Yeah, during the Bush years. It came out in 2006. And now he's one of many who's saying that, whoa, I wish we had George W. Bush as president.
That's what I'm saying. Like, there's an irony there, because it's like John Dean's like he writes worse than Watergate about Bush, and then it's like he has a series of books like even worse than Watergate and even worser than Watergate.
I know, and conservatives have been pointing this out, and this is one time where conservatives have a point, where they're like, oh, this is just trying to make a cheap comparison to Watergate. And I was like, well, yeah, I guess so. But having said that, it's still worth bringing up the history of the 1970s, because it's not a coincidence that there's so many clear connections between Nixon and Trump. I mean, they weren't best buds, but it's not a coincidence that they actually hung out quite a bit in the 1980s. That they were introduced to each other by John Connally, former Texas Democrat, Secretary of Treasury for Nixon, but also by Roger Stone. That's not a coincidence that they were part of these networks. And they're both connected to very ugly parts of modern American politics. And so I think bringing that out to light, I think, is something that's quite important to do, because then I think people can perhaps, and I don't think enough people are doing this, but then people can really confront the current like modern Republican Party.
Yeah.
Instead of just thinking, oh, Bob Mueller is going to be the new hero, just like we had heroes in Watergate, or this reporter is going to be the new, Woodward and Bernstein. That's not going to happen. And it's become quite clear that we're not going to have a Watergate Part 2. Instead, what we're living through is what Nixon and, Oliver Stone touches on this in his film. What we're really living through right now is what Nixon wanted in his second term, where he would have more control of the federal bureaucracy, where we'd have an actual media apparatus that could help spread his message. That's what we're living through. Yeah. We're not living through a sequel to Watergate. Just imagine if we didn't have the pandemic, where we would be in our in terms of the election, but also just the future of politics. So I think once you confront all of that, then you can really see how different our political culture is in 2020, and that we're not in the 1970s anymore.
That's what I'm thinking while you're explaining those connections between Nixon and Trump is sort of the way that Watergate in the imagination, and it's sort of in the Oliver Stone movie, which we should get to, the 1995 opus Nixon with Anthony Hopkins, but it's sort of in the American imagination. I don't know if you would agree with this, but I wonder what you think, because you study Watergate and Nixon a lot more than I do. But it's sort of like, it's almost like a liberal story, like it's a story of liberal heroes, right? It's a story of, in other words, the story that you just told is really like, another side of this, and maybe the more important one to contend with is that Nixon's, and Perlstein does this too, right? Is that Nixon's point of view and his set of political structures survived. And like, it's really a story of like conservative dominance in a lot of ways, more than a story of like liberal heroes. But it seems like we hear the liberal hero story a lot more.
I think that's spot on, David. And if I had to redo my book, I think I would have been more explicit about that, particularly in my conclusion. Mm-hmm. I think one thing I would have emphasized is that, yes, there were heroes during Watergate. They matter. I write about them, so I hopefully they matter. For one, those figures that stood up to Richard Nixon, as much as they matter, their influence greatly diminishes after the mid-1970s.
Right.
The guy who's featured on the cover of my book, Eliot Richardson, and I'll sometimes play clips of Eliot Richardson speaking. He was actually an advisor, kind of an informal advisor to the Oliver Stone film in the mid-90s. But this guy's, like, if you actually ever watch the clip of him speaking, he seems from a totally different planet. He has the Boston Brahmin accent, just a very kind of like stuffy, old school, like mid-20th century establishment figure. Nixon hated him, but Nixon kept him in the administration because he trusted him. This guy runs for Senate in 1984 in his home state. And a lot of people think he's going to be the next senator of Massachusetts. He loses in a Republican primary. In 1984, 10 years after Watergate, he loses by 20 points to a pro-Reagan Boston area businessman by the name of Ray Shammy. Mm. And this guy constantly attacks Richardson for not being loyal enough to Reagan, and he becomes the Republican nominee, ends up losing to John Kerry. But I bring that up because, look, one of the guys who's, like I said, he's featured on the cover of my book. He's one of the heroes of Watergate, hero of the Saturday Night Massacre, and the Republican Party, even in Massachusetts, has no use for him in 1984. Right. That's the story that people need to accept, is that, there's things to celebrate with Watergate. It's good to have people inside the government who are completely corrupt. But let's not fool ourselves. These people have not shaped American politics in quite a while. And I think their influence was perhaps always a bit overstated.
Yeah.
And so what that means, I'm just going to wrap this up.
Yeah, please.
Or at least wrap this part up, is what that means is that Watergate is a story of where the system barely worked. You often hear this is where the system worked. Well, it barely worked. And if we have to rely on a handful of guys, being sort of courageous, then that's a pretty awful system.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
and we can see how presidents can work around that system in the last 45 years, where no president has been held accountable for their crimes.
Well, let's go into the nostalgia trap of Oliver Stone's Nixon, because I think it might shed light on some of this mythology, because it really is like watching it last night, and I watched the entire 3-hour and 11-minute film last night, and watching it sort of reinforced what a like Shakespearean story. Maybe that's because Anthony Hopkins plays Nixon. I don't know what you think of Hopkins' performance as Nixon, but when I was young, I saw it in high school too. I was like transfixed by it, and I thought like this was a marvelous depiction of Nixon. But then I spent the next like 25 years kind of like studying American history, and like really, and then returning to it now is a very bizarre experience, because it feels more like Anthony Hopkins, Nixon it's more Anthony Hopkins than Nixon in this. But there's a point at the end of Oliver Stone's film, and maybe we can start with this, Mike, because it made me think of you. It's at the end of actually the JFK film as well, where Oliver Stone has a really kind of schmaltzy ending where he kind of refers to the historians of the future and sort of how blessed they are because they'll have access to archival information that we don't have. And he does it with JFK, and he says, someday they'll figure out, who really did this because they'll have more information. But at the end of Nixon, they say there are 4,000 hours of Nixon tapes, and they've only released 60. And historians of the future will be able to shed much more light than even this film was able to on Nixon. So, congratulations, because you're that historian of the future. But I wonder, do you think that's true? Do you think, in other words, I would assume you have to think it's true because you're involved in this. But sort of, are we really in a new Nixon moment? Is this film seem like dated or narrow because it didn't have the access that historians now have to the sort of evidence and data of what happened in Watergate, et cetera?
Yeah, I'm not going to be someone who, I'm no one, so I shouldn't tell Oliver Stone what films he should make. But my first reaction when I saw that final scene is, well, why did he make that film in 1995 if he has such little access to the Nixon tapes? I think what's useful here is to perhaps explain what's happening in the mid 90s in terms of how historians view Richard Nixon. I think it's something that we touched on the last time we chatted, David, a few years ago. Mm-hmm. But in the mid 90s, you're starting to see this new wave of Nixon revisionism. And of course, revisionism is an inevitable thing when it comes to any topic in history. But what you see, and it actually starts in the mid to late 80s, but it picks up steam in the mid 90s, especially after Richard Nixon dies in 1994. You have all these pretty kind and gentle obituaries where people are trying to be very nuanced when talking about Nixon's legacy. Bill Clinton famously says, granted, he's at a guy's funeral, so what else is he supposed to say? But he says, gone are the days where Nixon will be judged by just only Watergate. And the media picks up on that narrative. The one rare exception is Hunter S. Thompson, who writes one of his best essays just weeks after Nixon dies, where he suggests that Nixon's body should be dumped in a sewage canal in Los Angeles.
God bless Hunter. That's one of my favorite Hunter S. pieces, actually.
Oh yeah,
because he doesn't fall into that need to praise the man at all. It's wonderful.
I know, and that's, granted, one of Thompson's weaknesses was that he focused on individuals too much, but the fact that he couldn't get over his hatred over Nixon produced one of his greatest essays. And so, but he's the exception. There's not much room for that kind of level of Nixon hate in the media in 1994 and 95. And I think that shapes this film. Because what's also happening is that scholars are putting out books in the early to mid 90s that focus on Nixon's accomplishments outside of Watergate. You get books like Tom Wicker's Nixon, One of Us. Tom Wicker is a longtime New York Times writer, a former critic of Nixon, and now he's revisiting Nixon's accomplishments, saying, oh, well, I guess it wasn't that bad. And remember, these liberal journalists are writing in the wake of Ronald Reagan. They're now starting to realize just how conservative of a figure Bill Clinton is. And they're looking back to the 60s and 70s and saying, well, we actually had some liberal reforms under Richard Nixon.
Right,
maybe we should appreciate those reforms more than we did. You have a historian by the name of Joan Hoff, who was going to write a book, I believe it was going to be called Nixon Without Watergate. That was the original title. And that book is incredibly influential among Nixon historians. It's called Nixon Reconsidered. And what she does is she starts her book writing about how she protested Nixon in the 1960s and 70s, but now she appreciates Nixon because she's gone into the archives. She's gone into the White House textual materials, so all the paper records, and realizes that there were a lot of real smart guys in the Nixon administration who helped pass the EPA, who helped institute Title IX, great with Native American affairs, opened the door to China, and that Nixon is this really smart liberal. That narrative is picking up steam in the mid 90s.
I remember.
And I have to assume that Oliver Stone's reading those books.
Yeah, I remember. And even Michael Moore in one of his books, it talks about Nixon as the last liberal. And mentions, I swear if I hear the fucking EPA again, because everyone mentions the EPA with this, and I it's a much more complex story, I assume. But either way, there was that seems right. And the 90s were, he just died in 94, and I remember thinking like that sort of attitude in the air was, we were kind of too hard on the guy. He was actually really smart. He was a great diplomat, etc. And it definitely comes out in this movie. It's weird because this is after Oliver Stone made JFK. So like just to give people a little bit of context of like how big Oliver Stone was in the late 80s and 90s, because he was like and I think in some ways still the history filmmaker. Like, there's Spielberg, Robert Zemeckis maybe a little bit, but Michael Moore I think is maybe like Oliver Stone and Michael Moore I put together in my mind in some way. They have a similar like they have a sort of radical streak, but also a real like liberal nostalgia for the 20th century and for the 60s and all that boomer shit. Oliver Stone, so he made Platoon in 1986, which was huge in terms of like kind of rearranging the ideas around the Vietnam War and centering American soldiers as the sort of tragic experience of that. Born on the 4th of July in 1989, JFK in 91. The Doors, lest we forget The Doors, which is a movie that I watched a ton, and now I kind of cringe at it, but I think it's kind of a really entertaining film, a cartoonish vision of Jim Morrison. But he was on a run. Like, he had a ton of like really big hits during this era. And then I think Natural Born Killers came out in like 93 or 94, actually 94, around the time that the O.J. Simpson trial was sort of like, it just seemed like he was a zeitgeisty director, like someone who really captured the sort of left wing or even like conspiracy world of like this like underworld of American history. He even eventually does a documentary called The Untold History of the United States on, I think, HBO. I've never seen that.
Yes.
That's a whole other conversation.
That came out like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. So Nixon comes out in 95, and Nixon is, I feel like it's almost like one too many. I haven't seen his other his other presidential films. I haven't seen W. But either way, Nixon is Anthony Hopkins. What did you think of the casting of Anthony Hopkins as Nixon in this?
Well, I want to go back to what you said earlier, which is I watched this when I was in high school.
Yeah.
Because I think it was my sophomore year of high school. So it was like 1999, 2000. I watched JFK and I loved it.
Yeah.
I thought it was like, just unveiling this whole secret world of conspiracies. Like, this is the real history. Remember, I'm 15 or 16 at the time. And then after that, I watched The Doors. I watched Platoon. I watched Born on the 4th of July. And then I think Nixon was probably like the 5th or 6th movie I watched. And as a kid, I thought this was a fantastic biopic, kind of placing Nixon's presidency within this longer history of American conspiracies. And so I thought it was amazing. And I thought Anthony Hopkins, the guy from Silence of the Lambs, this is great. Sure, I probably noticed that the fact that his accent seemed a bit off.
Yeah.
And apparently Anthony Hopkins was quite insecure about that. I was doing some reading last week, and he even admitted he never got Nixon's voice totally right. But I thought it was great at the time. Rewatching this last week, I think Hopkins, he's a great actor. I think he's talented, of course, but he's not Nixon. He nails Nixon when he's incredibly sad and when he's drunk and he's on pills.
Yeah.
I think he nails Nixon during those moments. But as someone who's listened to the Nixon tapes, he doesn't really capture like Nixon's anger. I think Hopkins is just too sympathetic.
Yeah.
He's too much of a sad sack. And Nixon, I think Nixon is far uglier on the tapes than what you see in this film.
Well, maybe
which
we can talk about that in terms of like this, because this is a pretty sympathetic vision of Nixon. Actually, like I was surprised actually when I watched the movie in high school. I probably was like, wow, that showed the story of a villain, you know. But now watching it, I'm like, it's a lot of this psychology, a lot of this stuff about like his Quaker childhood and his mom and dad. And what do you think of that whole take? Because it seems like we like to do that. I say we, but like historians, liberals, people that are remembering Nixon tend to like really concentrate on psychology more than anything else. And this film certainly does that.
Yeah, and it's hard not to do when you're studying Nixon, because I mean the guy is such a weird figure, you know. Like, and as someone who listened to the tapes for my book, you know, there were moments where I felt bad for Nixon. But what's frustrating is how someone like Oliver Stone, but also much of the general public, can't get past that feeling of pity. You know, the guy is the president of the United States. He's not some random nerd. This guy was in charge of bombing hundreds of thousands of civilians in Vietnam, if not more. And so I think this focus on biography and psychohistory really makes you think, like, what's the point of actually doing a biopic on a president?
Yeah, I was thinking that the whole time, and I was almost like, because there was a lot of like, there's a lot of Anthony Hopkins kind of sitting around alone, ruminating over the tapes, and that's sort of one of the gimmicks of the film, is sort of that he's thinking about Watergate, and he's thinking of like, I think they're going to depict like him literally erasing the tapes at some point. But either way, there's a lot of sort of like, asking you to feel sorry for him, and I really thought like this movie could be made about any president. You could really, in other words, they're trying hard to make Nixon look really like this anomaly, but at the same time, I feel like you could make a movie about Bill Clinton sitting around the White House this way. You know, it feels like I felt the same way about like, why are we watching this?
And David, you brought up W. I unfortunately saw that movie in the fall of 2008. So George W. Bush was still president. I remember my friends and I, or maybe it was in 2009. It was either towards the end of his presidency or shortly afterwards. But I just remember we went to the theater. We were pumped to see it. And then we were all just like disappointed, because half of the movie was looking at Bush's childhood, looked at his complicated relationship with his father. It was a pretty sympathetic depiction of George W. Bush. Very different from, I don't know what you think of the movie Vice by Adam McKay. I thought that's actually, the biopic of Dick Cheney, I thought was one of the better, biopics I've seen. Whereas watching a movie like Nixon, have you ever seen the movie Dewey Cox, Walk Hard?
Yeah,
Dewey Cox? Right. This kind of reminded me of it, where you have very quick scenes. Everything's super heavy-handed. You're like, all right, here's Nixon's childhood. And within a few minutes, you learn about his asshole dad, his religious mom, his two brothers that have died. But it's all done like within a few minutes.
Yeah.
And this is one. And then here's the vice presidential years. Here's in 1962, and you just kind of jump really quickly from moment to moment, and you don't really learn that much about each of these moments. And which is why I wonder why Oliver Stone decided that this was the best way to explain Richard Nixon. He does the same thing in W.
Yeah.
And I think what you end up having is just something similar to like a Forrest Gump version of history, where it's basically a bunch of references with no real deep understanding of American politics, American culture, or hell, even Nixon the man. I mean, we know that he's a pathetic kind of sad guy, but it doesn't really go beyond that.
Yeah.
And we know that he sees himself as an outsider. He sees himself, and this is one of the trickier things of the film, he sees himself as separate from the beast, which is brought up several times.
Is that the deep state?
Yeah, basically. I mean, and Oliver Stone describes it in some interviews when he was doing press for this movie as, corporate power, military power. And yeah, I mean, right on. Those things shape American politics. I don't see how Richard Nixon is separate from that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's almost like
I
people.
don't see how.
It's almost like people convincing themselves that Trump is somehow separate from that. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah.
Right. And yeah, it's funny because Oliver Stone during I'm glad we're looking at him now after the sort of like high school years when it was impossible to sort of understand this stuff in context. But Oliver Stone, to me, you know, you mentioned these other biopics like Vice, you know, or Dewey Cox, which isn't really a biopic. I guess it's kind of but like either way, you know, I think that shows a little bit of like how stale that biopic genre can be. And like watching Oliver Stone's Nixon, I'm thinking, God, I thought this was such a wild, like, experimental art director. Like, I thought Oliver Stone was, you know what I mean? And instead, I'm like, this is the most conventional story. Like, we have string music that's like bringing in the melodrama, telling us how to feel. You know,
by John Williams.
Yeah, that's right. It is John fucking Williams. Like, literally the worst. Like, literally the hammiest shit. Like, it's really like a very, very, very conventional film. And I think that's kind of hilarious because Oliver Stone, like, you know, at some point in the 90s, he grew a little mustache and like started going to Cuba a lot and hanging out with Castro. And he like fashions himself as some sort of radical, but he makes very square ass movies, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I think what this film does is it kind of reminds you of what perhaps bugged you, even if you like a film like Platoon or Born on the 4th of July. And I generally think those are pretty good films.
Agreed.
There's still things that bug me about those films. All the worst parts of those films are really, really at the forefront of this film.
What do you mean by that? What are the worst parts of those?
Well,
films?
because I think Stone is a very clear-cut guy. He likes there's villains and there's heroes.
Yep.
You know, and even if something like Platoon, like maybe he's focusing on he's not focusing on actual foreign policy leaders. I know other people have pointed this out. I know Chris Appy points this out all the time. You can only get so much from a film like Platoon or other Vietnam War films that are only focusing on the grunts. But still, a film like Platoon has a good guy and a bad guy. You know, people who are at least trying to stand up to whatever is happening in Vietnam, and guys who are much more gun-ho about it. Born on the 4th of July, that's a very clear-cut story. Where you have a good guy and a bad guy. Even though it's once again, you don't have any real leaders in that film. You have, Tom Cruise as Ron Kovic fighting against the system. That makes sense. And it's actually a plot that makes sense, but with Nixon, like trying to pit him as a sympathetic figure who does bad things, he's an anti-hero, but he's somehow operating against the beast, against the system, makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
And so that's where you see kind of the limits of Oliver Stone's kind of Manichaean like approach to history. Like, I mean, yeah, nuance is fine, but if focusing on these great men of history, you have to vilify some of them too. And the fact that he struggled to do so with Nixon and later struggled to do so with W, I think says something about his politics. Yeah,
I agree. And I wonder what that is. You should say more about that because it fits into Jim Morrison too. He doesn't really know what to do with Jim Morrison, right? Like he's kind of is this guy a hero or what? Like what is this person? He doesn't really ever come down on it. Not that he has to make a judgment about the guy, but it seems like we never really get to know Jim Morrison in that movie. It's like kind of presented as a sort of okay, this is like basically the guy I already sort of assumed it was, communicated in pop culture. There's no interrogation of who this person was like as a human being.
No, yeah, I mean, he's almost presented as this like mystical, like Native American figure.
That's right.
Who presides over the late 1960s.
So lame.
But I think one thing that we cannot ignore when looking at Nixon, and I think this may explain perhaps some of the weaknesses of even Stone's better films, and this is something that David, I've really appreciated the conversations you've recently had with Danny Bessner, but also with Justin Rogers Cooper and Bill Black. I mean, one thing that comes up over and over again in your conversations is that boomers are talking about their parents.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening in this film. For those who haven't watched the film, well, for one, Oliver Stone dedicates the film to his dad. When he's promoting the film, he brings up his dad over and over again. because one of the ways that this film was marketed was Oliver. This is a kinder, gentler Oliver Stone. The film flops. It doesn't make any money, but it gets some praise. Roger Ebert loves the film. The other critics love the film, and it's marketed as Oliver Stone with some nuance. And this is not the Oliver Stone of JFK. This is not the Oliver Stone of Wall Street. Instead, this is a more sophisticated Oliver Stone, and Stone, I think, definitely pushes that too in some of the interviews he does, and he brings up his dad, where he says he comes out and says that his dad was very similar to Nixon, and in this film he's trying to understand his father. Yeah, and that's incredibly problematic. Not to use an overused word, because once again, I mean, Oliver Stone's dad was not president of the United States,
right?
Right. So even if Oliver Stone's dad, and he brings up his dad as someone who had a conversion later in life, where he starts off as a Republican, a pro-business Republican, and then by the 1970s and 80s, he moves in a more liberal direction. Well, that never happened with Richard Nixon. And so I think, once again, we're dealing with a baby boomer who just wants to write about their family.
Yeah, he kind of loves Nixon.
And it's happening in 1995. Just as, you have a movie like Forrest Gump, Saving Private Ryan's a few years later. And so I think this film, actually, even though it's not very popular, it's kind of, it's a failure for Oliver Stone, but it also marks the beginning of kind of a new stage of his career, where he's no longer the cool, edgy, but also commercially successful left-wing filmmaker. Instead, he's kind of existing in some sort of more complicated place.
Yeah,
within Hollywood.
Yeah, I have not followed his career. I mean, I realized, actually, looking at his filmography last night, I'm like, all right, Nixon came out in 95. It's been 25 years. What's he done since then? I think the only thing I've seen of his is Any Given Sunday, the football film with Al Pacino, which I'd have to go back to, because I remember it's got some really great screamy Al Pacino scenes. But that was another, like, huge movie. I think it was pretty, like, it was a pretty big hit, that film. But you're right. He doesn't have that particular, like, suite of films that he made, from like Platoon through Nixon, was like a 10-year period where he cranked out, like, he was the edgy guy. And for people that don't remember or weren't around or are too young, Natural Born Killers was like a massive, like, cultural phenomenon. It was on the cover of magazines. People were discussing it as if it was like a really important work of art. A lot of people were really upset about, like, how graphic the violence and sexuality and drug use and just overall. That movie I got to watch again. It's been a long time, but it was, it's a film that's within that like Tarantino thing that was happening during the 90s, right? Tarantino wrote Natural Born Killers, if I'm correct. And Hollywood made some Tarantino movies like True Romance, where they sort of, like, looking back at those now is kind of weird, because you're seeing, like, Tarantino scripts made by other directors. And Natural Born Killers was one of those. But either way, he was edgy, and he's not edgy after Nixon. Like, Nixon is like I said, I mean, Nixon comes off as like an apology for Nixon in some ways. And I'm wondering, like, the thing that I remember about it the most is, like, my sort of, like, I guess you would call this nostalgia trap, because, like, I was really affected by this stuff when I was in high school, right? It was like there was a romance to the JFK movie. There was a romance to Nixon and all that stuff. But I feel like, Born on the 4th of July makes you cry, literally. Like, Tom Cruise's performance, there's a scene that I've shown actually in my classes. And I don't know if you agree, if you think it's corny, if Tom Cruise's performance isn't great, but, like, there's a scene where he has a drunken fight with his family about the Vietnam War. And it's a scene where he basically, like, tells his family, like, none of the things that I believe in matter to me anymore, including, like, God and the president and sort of that. And his dad ultimately, like, takes him to bed and, like, puts him to bed. And Tom Cruise is, like, drunk, falling asleep, and he just says to his dad, like, who's gonna love me? Who's gonna love me? Who's gonna love me? I honestly think that's one of like the most, like, the finest, like, Oliver Stone moments, where you actually sort of connect like something like really emotional and personal to like the larger war stuff. In Nixon, it's you don't get moments like that. In Nixon, it's starting to get really hammy, and I'm wondering if he's ever achieved that level of art again, because even Platoon has like really beautiful moments to an otherwise, we can pick apart the plot, but those movies were compelling for a reason, and it feels like Nixon is starting to slip. He's starting to feel, you know what it is? He's becoming an old man. I think that's part of what's happening. He's getting older in Nixon. That's what it feels like.
That could be it. Maybe 1995 was, the very last year a boomer could be cool. No, but I mean, I do remember that scene from Born on the 4th of July, and yeah, it is incredibly moving. And as I said, I'm still a fan of that film. I rewatched it a couple years ago, and it holds up. Mm-hmm. John Williams does the score for that film, and it doesn't bug me nearly as much as it does with Nixon.
Dude, they do. I think they do Moon River they use Moon River in Born on the 4th of July, which is like really, I mean, you talk about like schmaltzy, like da 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 da. But I heard it on I listen to NTS radio all the time, and for whatever reason, that Moon River came up the other day, and I was like, I think that's from Born on the 4th of July. And I'm actually feeling the deep well of like tragedy and sadness that he evokes with that. So yeah, he can be effective. I will admit that.
Yeah. And so once again, I don't want to trash Oliver Stone's entire legacy. I just find it interesting that his like first kind of like not so great film in a while is with Nixon.
Yeah.
That Nixon's the point where he can no longer like actually capture the audience. Where he can no longer make as much money off of just revisiting the 1960s and 70s, because even though he has a successful film later on with Any Given Sunday, he's not at the forefront of Hollywood. I mean, that's Quentin Tarantino in the mid to late 90s.
That's right. Yeah,
it's not Oliver Stone. And so I think it's interesting that they work together on Natural Born Killers, and Tarantino becomes a much more influential director later on, where Stone produces films like there's U-Turn, there's Any Given Sunday, and then there's Alexander in 2004.
Boo.
Which, have you ever seen that film?
No. With Colin Farrell?
The reviews were so bad that I never watched it. You have World Trade Center in 2006. and W. And he doesn't really kind of go back to his kind of like edgier kind of politics until his documentary series on the history of the United States. So you're right that run, I think, was incredibly powerful from Platoon through Natural Born Killers, because it covered a lot of ground, and I think there's a lot of great scenes in those films.
It made us historians.
Yeah.
In some way, I mean, I'm serious when I say that. I know you probably are too, that in some way, Oliver Stone's like really edgy history films drew me into thinking about JFK and Nixon and shit like that. And I would honestly say, like, I became a historian in part because I was deeply affected by Oliver Stone films, Michael Moore films. That's part of why we have a lot to say about them. And now we're like, going back and being like, wait a fucking second. I got drawn into some weird mythology there. And I'll say this, like, I wonder what you think about this, because one of the things that really impressed me now that I remember about Nixon, and watching it again last night, I realized, oh, no wonder it impressed me. Like, they really center this throughout the film, but really this moment at the end where Nixon looks at the picture of JFK while he's like drunk in the middle of the night. I remember like tears welling up in my eyes when I was a kid, because I was like, oh my God, like what amazing sort of statement, because Nixon looks at the picture of JFK, and this is sort of like the thesis of the film, I would say, in many ways. And Nixon looks and says to him, they look at you and they see what they want to be, and they look at me and they see what they are. And there's all this pathos and tragedy. And actually, watching it again, I was like, you can actually hear Hopkins' British accent when he's saying this. He's like, they look at me. Anyway, I'm not going to do it, but I wonder. Yeah,
the very next scene.
Yeah.
Is Nixon as a child.
That's right.
With his mother.
Oh, Jesus.
Giving him medicine, telling him if you throw up, you'll feel better.
Unbelievable. She's giving him the ayahuasca dose at the end there. That I wonder what you think about that mythology, though, because it seems like really heavy-handed in the film is that Nixon I mean, and it's something that you bring up in like every fucking history of the 60s. It's always like, well, you know, the 1960 presidential debate was really about Nixon being ugly on TV and sweaty and gross, and JFK looking really good, and that started the Camelot era. And a lot of what Nixon is like doing in the 1960s is like stewing over his hatred of the Kennedys, and comparing himself against them. And there's like obviously deep psychology with like the, you know, who's handsome and who's ugly. But beyond that, it seems JFK seems to stand in for, you know, the entire elite Northeast political establishment and cultural establishment that Nixon sees himself as against. Almost like JFK is the beast in some ways. I wonder what you think about that. Like, how much is that true, and how much does this film overplay that?
Well, Stone definitely does that in terms of Nixon's jealousy of JFK, and that's a real thing. I think most Nixon biographers would agree that Nixon. I mean, how could he not be jealous of Kennedy? You know, I mean, if you lose to someone in a close election and you believe that the election was stolen from you, although historians argue about that, of course you're going to be jealous of the guy. You know, and you combine that with liberal media bias, you could see why he would resent Kennedy. But Kennedy is still depicted as a progressive hero in this film. There's one scene where Nixon is talking to a bunch of guys in Texas who are trying to convince him to run in 1964. And it's never, you never are told who these guys are, but they're business leaders. So these are corporate leaders in Texas. And actually, it's November 1963, so it's just days before the Kennedy assassination.
I felt that those scenes were almost like deleted scenes from JFK. It's like these smoky rooms with some like Texan guys, Larry Hagman among them, playing a character named Jack Jones who doesn't exist. Like he's like a sort of character that they put together in the same way that they put together the X character that Donald Sutherland plays in JFK to sort of speak the conspiracy. But yeah, what are all those scenes about? Because I didn't really catch like what's happening there and who those characters were.
Actually, I was looking at my notes. I just realized I combined two different scenes. So there's a scene later in the film with that same group.
Right.
And they said, at one point they say, we've already had one radical in the White House. I don't believe we could survive another. So just think about that. JFK is described as a radical. Yeah. Now, yes, this is a conservative businessman saying that, but Oliver Stone doesn't seem to be questioning that.
No,
you know, and if you combine this film with JFK, Stone is still holding on to that image of JFK as this, you know, this person who was going to end the Vietnam War and was killed because he was a champion for peace. I mean, I don't know how you feel about the JFK conspiracies. I'm kind of agnostic. I think it's possible, but I don't really care. But he certainly was not a radical, and Stone kind of leaves that for the audience as something that they can embrace.
I remember that.
Especially if they've seen JFK.
Yeah, I internalized that as true from that movie. You know what I mean? Because and that's kind of like speaks to the danger of these fucking movies. Because I watched this, you know, at JFK at an even younger age. And I definitely was like, oh, so JFK was like this guy that was trying to end the Vietnam War, and the forces that really are like pro-war forces, whoever those bad guys are, they killed him. And that seems like, I mean, get Frederick Logeval on the phone, because you know we had him on a few years ago, and we spent almost the entire episode, and people can go back because I really love that episode. We spent the almost entire episode, you know, just deconstructing that whole idea, and you know he's a very careful and articulate historian that was able to sort of say with a lot of nuance that that's absolutely absurd idea that Kennedy's some anti-war figure. In fact, you know, it's possible to conclude that Kennedy would have been, you know, more skeptical about you know putting ground troops in and things like that. But at the same time, it's like really weird that Stone lays his sort of reasoning of the assassination on that. But the assassination comes up a lot. Like it seems like Nixon is almost like afraid of like. I mean, I wonder what you think about that stuff, because I wasn't entirely sure what they were referring to. But Nixon's like afraid of the Bay of Pigs. Like whenever the Bay of Pigs comes up, it's like some word that like he freaks out. What is that referring to in that movie?
So, I mean, based on what I can gather from just reading a few interviews, what Stone is hinting at throughout the entire film, and much of the media focused on this in their reviews, because they would balance out this portrayal of Stone as being a little gentler with this film with the fact that he still can't get over the JFK conspiracy, so that gets brought up quite a bit. But yes, throughout the film, Nixon is afraid of the Bay of Pigs story coming out. And so what they're saying is that the plots that were established during the Eisenhower administration, and Richard Nixon, of course, was vice president during the Eisenhower years, carried over into the Kennedy administration. You saw the Bay of Pigs in 1961, but then they spun into the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Now, that's all true. But what's being hinted at in this film is that got out of control and it spun into the JFK assassination. Mm. So, and yes, there is a lot of overlap when you look at these different characters. I mean, the Cubans are the anti-Castro Cubans are featured in this film. Some of them break into the Watergate building. But the idea that Nixon was haunted by the JFK assassination is there's no proof of that. Mm.
It's Stone putting that there.
And it's hinted. I mean, I guess it's possible he talks about that on the infamous 18.5-minute gap, but there's much more logical theories that are connected to actual misdeeds that Nixon did, where there's like definitive archival proof, trying to interrupt the 1968 peace negotiations between Lyndon Johnson and the North and South Vietnamese. I think that makes much more sense in terms of something Nixon was paranoid about. But Stone can't let go. And so as much as Stone comes close to diagnosing what's actually happening during the Cold War, he still can't let go of this like very individualistic take on U.S. history, where you have heroes and you have villains, and then for some reason Nixon is kind of in between. And I mean, as we already said, depicting Kennedy as a hero is complicated and if not wrong. Yeah. But depicting Nixon as this anti-hero that you can kind of root for when he's in a room with a bunch of, conservative businessmen is also ridiculous. I think there's one part of the film where Nixon is hanging out with these business guys. He's hanging out with Larry Hagman, and I don't know if it's Hagman or someone else. They sit down and they zip up their pants because they just finished like sleeping with one of the pretty girls who's hanging around for these politicians and business leaders to hang out with. And there's one like attractive blonde who's flirting with Richard Nixon. I don't know if you recognize her. She's actually
Billy Madison.
Yes. So it's Billy Madison's girlfriend.
And I think Pete Sampras' wife in real life.
Oh, really?
It's like this woman has a name, but we're just attaching her to like the two things I know her from.
Yeah, and because I watched Billy Madison so much as a kid, I know it's Veronica Corningstone.
That's right. Oh my God, that's so embarrassing. I watched Billy Madison so many fucking times. Jesus.
Yeah, but
that's the first thing I thought.
Yeah, and she tries to make a move on Nixon, and Nixon shows pictures of his kids to her, and awkwardly like turns her down. And so Nixon is seen as this kind of like, even though he's flawed, even though he does a lot of bad things, he's seen as this honorable guy who's not as bad as the people who are a part of the beast.
Yeah, that's an odd scene. That's a really weird scene. And they even like when he's with the beast figures, Larry Hagman is among them, but that's this sort of like Oliver Stone likes to I think it's almost a cliche that he developed of like this smoky room. That's you mentioned that like zipping up of the pants, which is done from a very low angle, so you don't see faces, you just see sort of like bodies milling about. I mean, he definitely has like an aesthetic. I felt like there were moments that were like natural born killers in this because it's like literally clicking back and forth between color and black and white for no reason whatsoever, just like throughout the entire film. But that contact that he has with these sort of like vaguely like gangster criminal element, you assume they're associated with the JFK assassination because in that scene, in November in Dallas, they're like, we're going to run him out on a rail when JFK comes to this town. We don't want him in Dallas, etc. And Nixon says that Anthony Hopkins, as Nixon says, no one's going to be able to beat JFK in 64. No one can beat Kennedy in 64. It's almost like saying like you're gonna run against Obama, like no one's gonna beat this guy. And one of these guys like very cryptically suggests, well, suppose JFK is not on the ticket. And he's like literally like seems to be suggesting like we'll throw him in, we'll take care of him, we'll whack the guy. And there's a couple instances like this in the movie where like there's so much violence comes up about Kennedy and Nixon doesn't react. Like he doesn't say anything. Stone portrays Nixon as sort of like uncomfortable with that sort of talk and changing the subject in the same way that he does with the girl that's trying to lure him into sex. So like, in other words, like what you've identified, Mike, is something I think is really an important part of this, because it's like it shows, Nixon's limits. Nixon's ultimately a guy that would never go down that road of like assassinating JFK. He would never go down there. There's a fundamentally decent guy. It's almost like Oliver Stone takes seriously the fucking Checkers speech and is like that, that's the actual guy. When you at the same time, Stone seems to obviously know what a famous like act of emotional and political manipulation the Checkers speech was. It's a really weird movie because it's like it seems to like condemn Nixon for being like a weak leader and one that got sucked into really shitty things that he shows again and again, including Vietnam. And he shows the burning in Vietnam. He shows the violence of Vietnam, and obviously Stone is angry about that. Yet it's like, what the fuck? Like, you made a movie about the guy that like killed 3.5 million Vietnamese people, extended the war like for no reason, only for his own political gain. You made a movie about that, Oliver Stone, angry Oliver Stone, and yet that movie is also like a really kind of like sentimental, like, oh, the guy's kind of a good guy. Like it's there's something really interesting about the fact that liberals, and I'll call Oliver Stone a liberal, can hold those two things in their head and head and heart at once. And Mike, it explains everything that's wrong with the world.
I was curious to see what you thought about the film's depiction of Henry Kissinger, because I think Paul Sorvino does a pretty good job.
Yeah,
his impression of Kissinger I think is spot on, but I wanted to know what you thought of the depiction of Kissinger and the scenes that featured Kissinger, because I thought that was also pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he comes off as the playboy Kissinger in some ways. This film shows him saying the famous line to Mao, actually. He says, if the power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, because Mao asks him, how's a fat man get so many women or something like that? Did that actually happen? Is that really like the exchange between Mao?
Yes.
Oh my God. Yeah. Okay, so like, I thought that was funny, but it's almost like Kissinger is almost like a comic figure in this film, or one that like is trying to almost like restrain Nixon in some ways, but they also seem like they show that that Kissinger and Nixon like had this special relationship that the other guys like Haldeman, Ehrlichman, they're all jealous of, and they hate him, and ultimately think and reveal at the end that he's like the leaker, like he's the guy from the White House that like they couldn't trust. So yeah, what do you think of Kissinger? I thought it's a pretty, I mean, it's just like the other depictions. It's a very like greatest hits sort of take. Yeah,
and so some of the things you listed are correct. Kissinger leaked all the time. I think a lot of scholars, not all, but a lot of scholars agree that was one of the main reasons why Nixon set up a taping system, is he wanted to take credit for a lot of his foreign policy decisions when he knew Kissinger was going to try to do that. And so he wanted a record that he assumed he would control for the rest of his life. Of course, that spins out of control. But And Kissinger did have a weird relationship with Nixon and Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They were often at odds with one another when it came to especially media outreach. Having said that, though, what this film does is a little weird. Because yes, Kissinger is mentioned as a playboy. He's seen as this impressive figure, but he's also they show that Nixon bullying Kissinger. And they suggest that Kissinger is one of the reasonable ones in the room.
Yeah.
One of the adults in the room, to use a phrase that we hear over and over again these days. And I hate to bring this up because I know it's obnoxious to say, well, I've listened to the tapes. But if you listen to the tapes, Kissinger is as aggressive as Nixon when it comes to Vietnam, especially.
Savage.
I mean, yes, he's a realist, compared to, neocons and other people who have just a really, really kind of imperialistic outlook on U.S. foreign policy. But as Greg Grandin and other scholars have pointed out, the difference between Kissinger and perhaps some of those neocons is that the line is pretty thin, and it's often quite blurry.
Yeah.
And you hear that in the tapes. I mean, the sophisticated Nixon, the sophisticated Kissinger that you see in the press, and you still see it to this day. I mean, most recently, Stephen Colbert welcoming Kissinger to his shows, because he's seen as this wise sage of U.S. foreign policy. You don't hear that in the tapes. It's not something I was looking for, but Kissinger is constantly pushing Nixon to be more aggressive. He's actually, you can make the case that he's actually more hawkish than Nixon. And yes, there are these moments where Nixon is anti-Semitic, sometimes right in front of Kissinger. And I'm sure those moments were awkward. But I was bothered by the fact that in this film, you think that Kissinger is just this like kind of more moderate figure within the Nixon White House.
Yeah, that's weird.
And so, yes, he wasn't directly involved in Watergate, but that's not because of any kind of there's no real moral reason for that. It's just that he wasn't part of Nixon's inner circle when it came to enacting abuses of power within the government. When it came to foreign policy, he was a part of Nixon's inner circle. And so I was really bothered by that. I think Stone is in some ways participating in this kind of softening of Kissinger's image in this film.
Yeah.
At the same time, you do see these scenes where bombs are being dropped on Vietnam. You see very quick scenes, if I'm remembering correctly, of civilians suffering from the bombings of Vietnam. But it's very, very quick. And then at the same time, you see this kind of, celebration of Nixon and Kissinger because they opened up China. It's very weird. There's a lot of contradictions. The sad thing is, and you pretty much said it, David, is I think this is how most liberals view Richard Nixon.
Yeah. Yeah. And Kissinger too.
And it's kind of depressing.
It is. It is.
And I think this is something we've talked about before, because if you can't confront the ugliness of Nixon's presidency, then you're not going to be able to do it for Trump.
Not at all.
10 or 20 years from now. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Like I said, the only exception to this disturbing pattern in popular culture of constantly rehabilitating presidents, or maybe half rehabilitating presidents, is Vice, where you have that very interesting scene in Vice where Dick Cheney retires from politics, and then he goes with his family, and you have this really schmaltzy music, but then there's like a really kind of quick cut. And then the film then says, well, that's not what happened. And then the last part of the film, you learn about the ugliness of the Bush administration. I thought that was quite clever, because it kind of played around with the form of trying to always depict these guys as perhaps more nuanced than they actually were. Because one thing I say about Nixon is if you listen to the tapes, he actually is not that different from what you saw in the underground press in the late 60s and early 70s. People aren't always nuanced.
Right.
And I think guys like Oliver Stone, for whatever reason, can't accept that. I think he's just too obsessed with trying to compare Nixon to his dad. His dad was someone who lost a ton of money on Wall Street. Oliver Stone felt that his dad was cheated by the system. And Nixon is depicted as Oliver Stone's dad in this film. As someone who's bad, did bad things, but was screwed over to the system. And that's what viewers should really focus on, instead of seeing that person as an incredibly powerful part of the system. I mean, once again, President of the United States. This is not just some random guy. President of the United States. Just like Donald Trump is President of the United States. And I think back to an episode you did, David, with Justin Rogers Cooper, where the thing that a lot of people, and I think this describes a lot of, kind of casual consumers of the news, when they talk about the deep state, they focus on individuals. They even focus on pretty small networks. They're not focusing on the broader picture. The deep state is capitalism. And maybe that doesn't make for an interesting film, Um, but that's the thing. I think a lot of these guys, even if they're on the left, are struggling to deal with.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think Oliver Stone is definitely struggling to deal with that. And I think that's what makes him such a frustrating presence. And I don't know what he's, where he's at and what he's done in the last many years. But, that burst of historical films was really struggling to sort of come to terms with something that I think touches on and gets close to capitalism, and gets so he seems to have a lot to. It's even in this film, right? He's obsessed with Cuba. Like Stone is obsessed with Cuba as this sort of like project against capitalism, right? I mean, he seems to understand that maybe the beast, the deep state, capitalism, maybe those things are all connected. I did not see the Wall Street sequel, Money Never Sleeps, which has such a corny title. But either way, I mean, it seems like that. I think that's what is frustrating about Stone, is that he seems to be a guy that almost is there in terms of a really kind of like nuanced, powerful left-wing take on capitalism and the 20th century and history. But at the same time, he is subjected to the nostalgia trap, I hate to say it, of really like really sort of wanting to bathe in the 1960s and the feeling that like that was the moment for him that was like really important. And I think that the other thing I would say, you mentioned Vice, but you have to use, I think that in like a postmodern era, films like Nixon just seem impossibly old-fashioned to me. That's what's kind of interesting, because in the 90s, Stone was like this, seen as this like director that was really bringing a sort of artfulness and edginess. I think that the soundtrack to this episode could be LCD Sound System's "Losing My Edge," because when you mentioned like Stone and Tarantino, he must have felt it, because Tarantino is probably like 10 years, 15 years younger than Stone, and seems to be doing like almost what Stone would want to do, because look at what Tarantino has done with American history. He's done like whatever you think of those films, Django Unchained, Inglourious Bastards, even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which are all about, these moments in history. And the latest one is about, the Manson murders, the 1960s, right in Oliver Stone's sort of wheelhouse. It must grind him up. But like, I wonder what you think of that, because it feels like the style of what Oliver Stone makes, those presidential biopics, it's not really hip anymore. And part of what we need satire and humor. You should be making comedies about this shit. And like I dread a Trump biopic, dude. Like I dread it. Like whatever it is, like just don't do it. Whoever's out there considering it, don't do it. I know we're gonna have to sit through it, but like, don't you think they'll just like what could be better than the like postmodern insane reality TV show that is the Trump white? It's already satire. In other words, it's, you know what I mean? Like it's already there. And it just feels like Nixon and those films are hopelessly out of touch at this point. Maybe that tells you how fast history's moved.
I agree. I think Oliver Stone's last hip moment was Natural Born Killers. I vaguely remember when I first started watching MTV, like MTV News covering that film quite a bit.
Yeah.
I remember music videos that were a part of that film soundtrack. And so I remember even as a 10-year-old, and so I'm barely participating in youth culture at that age. I remember that film being a part of popular culture. And then later on in the 90s, I think Oliver Stone is mostly seen as kind of like a parody of himself. There's this SNL skit, which I think is connected to the next point I'm going to bring up. There's an SNL skit from 1999 when I think it's right after Any Given Sunday came out. And I think, is Cuba Gooding Jr. in that film?
Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
So he was the host of SNL, and they do an opening skit where Will Ferrell is pretending to be Oliver Stone. And they just cram in a bunch of references to the Doors, to Nixon, to JFK, to Vietnam, and Stone is seen as this kind of like really grumpy old guy. And this is in 1999.
Wow.
10 years after he's kind of like at the top of Hollywood. And so I think even then he just no longer fits within late 90s culture, whereas Quentin Tarantino, like I said, is definitely, the guy of the 90s. But in terms of what we would do with Trump, I mean, that's just an interesting kind of exercise. Like, how would you do a Trump biopic if you were forced to do one? And SNL has shown us over the last 4 years that just repeating quotes is not funny. You know, like the actual as frustrating as enraging as it can be, like the original clips are much funnier than anything that Alec Baldwin or you know, anyone else in SNL is doing. I think that's something they've been struggling with in a very clear way over the last 10 to 12 years, ever since Sarah Palin, where I think reality is far, far more ridiculous than anything they can cook up. I guess one solution is just like, I don't know, like just make something so ridiculous and so vile that it somehow outdoes reality. I think if you're going to do that, it probably wouldn't be able to be on TV.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Connor O'Malley's Twitter feed or his the stuff he does on like Facebook Live or whatever he's doing, because that's so like just absolutely insane. It tells me too that like it's part of this whole like sort of entertainment industry, the like kind of the staleness of it. I mean, SNL, I mean, we've been talking about SNL for like a long time. Like to me, it's like gotten I can't look at it. I mean, it's so bad, but we've talked about this before that like I think we're in a moment where there is a sort of layers of culture happening all at once, and that stuff seems really, really, really outdated, yet it's somehow in the news all the time. Somehow I don't watch Saturday Night Live, but somehow I know exactly what every sketch is because they fucking report on it for some reason. I mean, it still is dominant in some way, but at the same time, it's really, really old and stale. Yeah.
I have to admit to watching every episode. I'm a completist, and I like to torture myself. Even though I've enjoyed an SNL season in over a decade, and you know, there'll be like one decent skit, but the politics especially have been excruciating over the last 4 years. And I think it is connected to something we're talking about, where I think if reality is actually more cartoonish than what you see in a film, in a skit, then what does that say for our culture? The Nixon tapes are much more entertaining than anything that's in this film.
Right.
You know, Oliver Stone has Richard Nixon after Kent State telling, I believe, John Ehrlichman, they were just throwing rocks, Bob, you know, saying that they didn't deserve to be shot. I mean, I hate to be that historian who says, well, Nixon never said that. There's no proof of that. It's not a matter of comparing whatever's in this film to the historical record. It's just Nixon's persona would not allow him to say that, even in private.
Right.
And there's even one scene where Nixon says, I'd like to offer my condolences to the family. Nixon can't. And he talks about himself in the third person.
See, Stone really like the fact that he like wants that stuff in the script, wants Nixon, Anthony Hopkins as Nixon to say these things. I mean, I was thinking the whole time, and I'm glad you mentioned Hunter S. Thompson, because I was wondering like what, you know, if Hunter S. Thompson were a filmmaker, what kind of film would he make about Nixon? You know what I mean? And it would be something a lot different from this. This is an apologia. Like this is really like. And I didn't read it that way when I was younger, and I think that's part of what we wanted to do here, Mike. So thanks for going down the road of Oliver Stone's Nixon with me, but it feels like it's changed, right? Your perspective on the film has changed, wouldn't you say?
Oh, quite a bit. I rewatched it last week. It was my third time watching it, and I guess I hate it every time. I hate it more every time I watch it. Once again, I apologize for making you watch this film, David.
It was fun.
But I think it's connected to some of the things you've been addressing and like the conversations you guys have been having, which are fantastic. They're really fun to listen to. I'm going to keep on listening to them. And I apologize for wedging this whole conversation of Nixon into this broader discussion on films from the 90s and boomers obsessed with their dads and wanting to turn presidents of the United States into their, you know, kind-hearted fathers.
What the fuck? Yeah, it's really important. Well, thank you, Mike, for writing me, because I will talk about Oliver Stone films some more with anybody, because they really are, like I mentioned, they really are. The more I think about them, they were formative to me, and now I'm thinking like I don't like these films at all. So I need to like come to terms with the values and the pieces of pop culture that formed me. And I think that's part of what we wanted to do with the '90s film series in general. So thanks for helping us do that. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you, David.
Okay, well, great. Now I feel like I have to go back and watch all of Oliver Stone's films again, so stay tuned. We may have some more episodes on this sometime in the future. I think I'll definitely take a break for now, though. But huge thank you to Mike Koncewicz. Go check out his book, They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. Really, really great historian, great book, and that was a really fun talk. So I hope you enjoyed that, and go torture yourself by watching 3 hours and 11 minutes of Anthony Hopkins blubbering through a weird performance of Richard Nixon. Thanks so much for listening to the show, being a supporter of the show. Just a quick reminder that we've got a live show this week, our first live show with Danny Bessner, Courtney Rawlings, and Bill Black, taking on some weird angles on this film Back to the Future from 1985. That will be Wednesday night, October 21st, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. If you want to sign up for that, just go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We are very much looking forward to getting a chance to interact with everybody who listens to and enjoys Nostalgia Trap. Thanks a million times, and we will talk to you very soon. All right, see ya.